Jesus came to save us, to do away with the us and them thing. And all of a sudden, how do I explain it to all of our friends that you used to eat with? And now, when all those religious yuppies walked in through the door from Jerusalem, you just began to disassociate and think that you were better than everybody else.
What's up, everybody? Happy Monday night. How we doing? Good. I am so excited to be here with you guys as we continue on this series. I'm pumped about this series, and if you weren't here last week, you missed an incredible message that Mr. Mark Papp brought, and where he kind of kicked this thing off, this confessions of a pastor, and he confessed a few things, one of which was really important that if you weren't here, you need to go back and watch. He confessed that he doesn't like Christians, and so we are praying for Mark's soul because he has this issue with Christians. But no, really what he was talking about is that sometimes as Christians, we are our own worst enemy, right? That we don't always practice what we preach. We can be hypocritical. And he had this bottom line that the moves you make prove the claim you stake. And it was a powerful message, so go check that out online if you didn't get to watch it last week. Speaking of if you're online, we want to say welcome. We are excited you're with us as well, and hope that you're checking in on there. Tell us where you're watching from, and we'd love to connect with you online as well. But it's my turn this week to talk about some confessions that I have. I got to get some things off my chest, all right? And, you know, Mark got to tell a little bit of some things that he just needed to get off his chest last week, so it's my turn. The first of which is I need to confess to some pranks that I've been pulling around here. I'm a bit of a prankster, if you don't know me this well, that I do this, especially with electronics. Like, if you leave electronics in my presence unattended, I will mess with you. Like, it's just who I am. I can't help it. So, like, if you leave your phone laying around and you're not there, you will find a selfie of me on your phone. I love to mess with our staff when they are not looking with their phones. Josh talked a couple weeks ago about somebody that changed his voicemail and unknowingly to him to leave a farm animal sound on his voicemail when he got the voicemail, and that was me. And I confess to that. That was me. I also confessed that one day this week in the office, Josh left his computer unattended, and I changed his 6:03 alarm to remind him on random dates that he needs to buy a brand new pair of Crocs. So he can look forward to that, Josh. Also, just another confession I need to make. And this one, you guys promise you won't judge me? I'm not convinced. You promise you won't judge me if I confess this one. So like I said, I'm a bit of a prankster sometimes. So I used to have this bad habit. Now, I promise you I don't do this anymore because I got in trouble by a mom who had a kid in driver's ed about this one. So, you know, when you're driving down the street and you see one of those cars that has like the student driver placard on it, I always thought it was fun to just, when I saw those cars and the kids learning to drive, like to just start driving really erratically, like just swerving and braking, speeding up, using the wrong turn signal, that kind of thing. I don't know why, I just thought it was funny, and I told myself I was just training them for the roads of New England. I mean, if you've driven in Boston, right? I'm just teaching these kids, but I don't do it anymore. Okay, I promise. I get that one off my chest. The other thing, if I can get serious for a moment, is that it's been a kind of a rough season for me. I think for a lot of us, there's just been a lot of death, and like kind of everywhere you look. And I confess that actually on the way here today, I contributed to it. I took out another squirrel, and man, I didn't have any choice. It just ran right in front of me, and I felt kind of bad because when I was a kid, I used to watch Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, and a little part of me just died today, along with that squirrel. I think that might also been what caused the love truck to blow out a tire. I'm not sure. That's my theory. But this squirrel thing, it's kind of crazy, right? It's a little disturbing. I don't know if you've noticed that, but anyway. But no, the real confession I came to give you today. Sorry, I'm like a squirrel. Yeah. The real confession I came to give you today is this. A lot of times as a leader, as a pastor, as just even a Christ follower, I feel inadequate. Like I feel like sometimes like I'm in over my head, like maybe I don't know what I'm doing. Like, God, why would you put me in this position to lead or to step out in faith? Like I don't understand why me, and like I don't feel like I'm good enough, for lack of a better word, to do this. Have you ever felt that way? Like why would God want me to be the one to do this? And I think that there's this feeling of inadequacy, and if we start to think about it, a lot of us, I think, can kind of pinpoint probably a moment in our life when we first felt this feeling of inadequacy, when maybe someone said something to you that like kind of cut you pretty deep, and you're like, man, and you start to question, like, do you have what it takes? There's this question, like, do I have what it takes? Or maybe you had a really bad experience happen to you, and it just kind of wrecked you from future events to just say, like, hey, because of this, like, I don't know, like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. I know for me, when I thought about, like, when was it this first moment when I first realized, like, I don't know if I'm adequate, I instantly jumped back in my mind to my junior year of high school, because a couple of events happened that year that I think started this kind of thought process in my head that, like, maybe I don't always have what it takes. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not adequate. And it started because I love to play basketball. Anybody in here like to play basketball? Cool. No, that's all right. No, me and you one-on-one later. All right. And I love to play basketball. I played ever since I was a boy, and I'm not to brag, confession, I'm pretty good. So I played, and I got to play and started actually, and I didn't start, I got to get playing time as a freshman on the varsity team, which was kind of a big deal. And then I got to play a little bit more my sophomore year. And so going into my junior year, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to be start one of the starting five, and I was excited for that. And that year we moved, and so I was like, oh man, I don't know what's going to happen. But we moved actually to a smaller town. So when I discovered where we were moving, this little bitty town, I was like, oh man, okay, I'm good. Like I'm gonna be all set. Like I can make this team. I'll run this team, kind of thing. Kind of got a big head. And then I walk into practice that day for the first time, and I look up because there's just a lot of tall guys, a lot of athletic guys, and I'm like, whoa, these guys are pretty good. Like I don't know if I'm gonna be as good off as I thought. And then just like everything that could go wrong in a tryout went wrong. Like I just was dribbling the ball off my foot. I was missing shots. I made some terrible passes. I went for a loose ball and I got hurt and like really hurt. And my coach just thought I was just like being a pansy. And I was like, no, like it hurts. And it just like I walked out of there just feeling defeated. And in my mind I was like, the coach is going to cut me from the team. And he called me in a few days later, and I thought, man, this is it. Here it goes. And he sat me down, and he said, Aaron, like, you didn't have the best of tryouts. And I was like, yeah, coach, I know, I promise. Like, I'm better than that. Like, that was not my best effort. I can do better than this. And he's like, I believe you do. And he's like, I don't believe in cutting people from the team. And I was like, whew, all right, good. I'm still on the team. But then he said, but, that word you don't want to hear next. He's like, but we had one more person try out than we had spots for on the team, like physical jerseys. We actually don't have enough jerseys for everybody that tried out. We're one short. So he's like, because you didn't do that well and this other guy didn't do that well, you two are going to share a jersey. And I was like, we can't both fit in one jersey. I don't understand. I'm not following what you're saying, coach. And he's like, no, like what I'm saying is that every other game you're going to sit out. Like one game you'll get to play, you'll get to suit up, and the other game you're going to have to sit there in plain clothes. You can travel with the team, and you can root on your team, but you're going to basically sit on the end of the bench like a water boy. And at first I was like, whew, that's pretty good because I didn't get cut. But then as the season went on, I'm like, man, this is not fun. Like to be reminded every other game to have to sit there and watch my teammates play and not be able to participate and not be able to be involved, and to be reminded that I wasn't good enough to be on that team just kind of wrecked me for that entire season. And then later on that year, I was just kind of wrestling. Your junior year is really formative. Like, what am I going to do in life? Like, what am I going to be? And my dad was a pastor, and he was a great pastor. And I was like, he's awesome, but that's not for me. That's not for me. I don't think I can do that. And I went to CIY conference, which is an incredible week. That's why we do that with our students, because it is a life-changing week. And it was for me. Because I remember sitting in this auditorium, and this guy was challenging people to step up to be pastors, to be kingdom workers. And I just kept saying, not me, God, not me, not me, not me. And God's like, no, you. I knew very clearly, like, no, he's calling you. I'm calling you to be this. And I'm like, why? Like, I don't understand, like, God, why you would want me to do this. But I went ahead and I was like, okay, God, if that's what you're going to do, I'll step out. I don't really know what this looks like. I don't know what this means. But I decided I was going to go to Bible college. But I had no idea, like, what I was going to do as a pastor, because I was terrible, like, petrified of public speaking. Like if I got on stage, I would just like start shaking and I would just sputter sentence fragments and no one would understand a word I could say. And I was like, so that's not, like I'm not going to be a preacher. And then I was really young, so I was like, well, I don't want to be a youth pastor. Those kids are my age. That's weird. And so I'm like, what are you going to call me into doing in ministry, God? And that's when he showed up, right? He did what he does when you make yourself available, and he landed me in this internship with children's ministry, which aligned kind of my passion and my heart for kids with the mission of God and this ministry. And I fell in love with what I could do in that ministry, and God just continued to grow me into other things. But I still, even still, felt inadequate, because all of a sudden then I was put into this like position of leadership at the age of 22 at this pretty big church over the children's ministry, where I was leading teams of volunteers that were like 40 and 50 and 60, and people that had way more knowledge and way more experience, and I'm like, why am I in charge? Like, why would they pick me to be in charge of this? This doesn't make sense. I mean, yeah, I can play with the kids, but why am I leading all these old people? Like, they have way more experience than me. And then, I would get put into these positions where I had to speak, and I'm like, I'm not good at this. Why am I doing this? But I just kept learning and growing, and you get more experience. But even today, even like, still to this day, I still can struggle with feeling this inadequacy. Like people will call me and they'll be like wanting me to talk with them about really crazy like situations that they're going through, like really painful stuff like hurt or addiction or the loss of someone that they love, and they're calling me. And I'm like, I don't know what to say. Like, what do you want me to do? But what I've learned is that even though I don't know what to do, if I'll just step out in faith, if I'll just go, like God will kind of fill in the gaps. Like he will provide. He will take care of it. And so that's what I want you to kind of wrestle with today as we look at this together, is this bottom line, this idea that God is more concerned with your availability than he is your adequacy. I'll say that one more time. God is way more concerned with your availability than your adequacy. And I think that the problem with this is this inadequacy feeling that we have is only made worse in the culture we live in today. There's a lot of things that propel this in us. And two of those things, I think, are this idea of criticism and this idea of comparison. And these two things kind of, when we start to wrestle with them or we see them in our lives, we start to question if we really have what it takes, and we let these doubts and we let these fears creep in because of these things. Let's start with criticism. Like, it's rampant. If you're online, you probably saw it already, because if you go on Facebook, all you got to see is just like logging in and people just bashing other people right behind the safety of their keyboards and just cutting other people down and tearing other people down instead of building them up. And we live in this world where online is like this safe place where you can say anything to anybody that you wouldn't say to them in person, to face. And we start to say things, and people say things to us that are really hurtful, and we start to wonder, like, do I have what it takes? And then this idea of comparison, which also is fueled, I think, online, because everybody posts their highlight reels, right? Everybody's posting their awesome vacations, they're not posting when they're on the airplane with like no leg room, right? They're posting the awesome beach views and all that, and they're posting their big house, and they're posting their new car. They're not posting the one they drove for 10 years before that looked like a broken down, junker. And they're posting the pictures of their kids smiling, right? And all happy. They're not posting when their kids are throwing a fit because they didn't get enough video game time, right? That we post this like ideal world, and then we look at that and we're like, oh, well, what I have isn't good enough. I need to do better. I need to be better. I need to be better. And so this like idea of comparison just keeps like fueling this thing, because when we are constantly comparing ourselves to others, we don't count the blessings that we already have. And so this feeling starts to creep in over time and becomes a big problem, because the reason it becomes a big problem, because in our faith, when we feel this way, when we feel inadequate, we start to miss out on the things that God is calling us to do. Because this feeling has a way of paralyzing us and stopping us and shutting us down from what God may be wanting us to step out in faith and to do. And here's the thing that I want us to wrestle with too today, is that God doesn't use perfect people. He uses available people. He just uses the people that are willing to step out in faith, and even though they may not know where they're going, even may they not know like how they're going to get there. He just says, hey, just follow me. And it's actually pretty comical. Like, if you look through the scriptures at what God used like for people to accomplish his purposes, the list is pretty not what you would think it was, right? Think about the people that he used. He used drunks, he used murderers, he used cheaters, he used liars, He used adulterers. He used prostitutes. He did not use perfect people because there are no perfect people. And here's the thing, when we start to believe that we are inadequate to be used by God, that we're somehow, because we're not perfect, we're not good enough, that we can't be used by God, we believe a lie. I love that song that we sang earlier, Reckless Love. It talks about there is no lie you won't tear down. Tonight I'm tearing down this lie for you. At least I'm going to try to. That you are adequate to be used by Christ. But we buy into this lie that because something in our life, because maybe something somebody said, or maybe something we did, or something we experienced, that we're not able to be used. And I think it's where this comparison trap can kind of trip us up, because here's the thing, and I'm gonna say this statement twice because I want it to kind of resonate in your head, is this: we are completely adequate, or inadequate. We are inadequate when we compare ourselves to Christ. But we are completely adequate to be used by Christ. Let me say it again, because I kind of fumbled over it the first time. We are completely inadequate when compared to Christ, but completely adequate to be used by Christ. And I think this is a big distinction we kind of have to draw in our lives, because we look at verses like Romans 3:23, which says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God," right? And so compared to God, yes, absolutely, 100%, we are not adequate. Like, we will fall short every time. He is perfect and we are not. But when Jesus came, like, he changed things. And when we follow him and we believe him and we accept him and we say, I'm going to follow you, and we step out in faith, he can do things in us despite those faults. That's why I love verses more like Galatians 2:20 that says this: I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. See, God's adequacy starts to fill in the gaps where we fall short. He takes those inadequacies in us and he starts to reveal his glory through them, and he does things that we could never imagine if we just make ourselves available to him. I also love this verse in 2 Corinthians 12:9. It says this. It says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." In other words, he is at his strongest when we are at our weakest, right? He takes these things that we think aren't good and he turns them into magnificent, powerful things to be used for his glory. And the problem, though, is that when we start to believe this lie, that he can't do that we're not adequate, we start to make a lot of excuses. Anybody in here ever making excuses? I know I have. And so I want to talk about some of these excuses that kind of feed out of this idea of inadequacy. And there's 4 of them I want to talk about today. This is not an exhaustive list, because we have a lot of excuses, but I think these are probably 4 of the most common ones I've heard over the years as a pastor. And the first one is this: I don't know enough. I don't know enough, so I can't be used by God because I don't know enough. Anybody ever said that? Or thought that? Or felt that? Let me share a little secret with you tonight. It's maybe the best news you hear all night. You're never going to know it all. Like, you're never going to know it all. And to think that you could know it all says to me that you have no understanding of who God is and how big he is. Like, that you are not going to know it all. I love what Matt Chandler says about this. He says this in his book, Explicit Gospel. He says, trying to figure out God is like trying to catch a fish in the Pacific Ocean with an inch of dental floss. It is a foolish act predicated on a foolish overestimation of human intellect and ability. Like, we are not ever going to know it all. And the problem is, when we say this, like, I don't know enough, it's just a cop-out, right? It's like, well, I don't know enough, so I'm just not going to try. I love also, there was a Christian artist a few years ago, and in a song he said, not knowing is an excuse for those unwilling to learn. And here's the thing, like, the best way for you to learn, the best way for you to grow is not to say, I don't know, it's to put yourself in a position where other people are looking to you for guidance, where other people are looking to you for answers, because guess what? You're going to figure it out real fast, right? If someone comes to you and they want to know something, you're going to go find out for them, right? And so that's the best thing, is to put yourself in a position, just like the disciples. Think about when Jesus called his first disciples. He just said, follow me. He didn't say, hey, you got to wait like a couple years, read a few books, and there's going to be like this exam, and then I'm going to show you some things, and then you're going to be disciples. No, he said, like, follow me. And they learned as they went, right? Because you learn as you go, but you can't learn if you don't go. And so here's the thing. When you step out and you go, I love that his verse, in the verses in the Bible, he tells us that his Holy Spirit is going to guide us. His Holy Spirit is going to fill in those gaps. It's going to even give us the words to say, or sometimes it's not even saying anything at all. Sometimes it's just showing up. Sometimes it's just sitting in silence with someone that's hurting. Sometimes it's just being there, because God is way more concerned with your availability than he is your adequacy. Second excuse we use, I'm too young or I'm too old. Anybody ever use that one? I'm too young or I'm too old. I don't know who this is, so I can't quote them, but I know I've heard this said somewhere. Age ain't nothing but a number, right? God can use anyone. Working in children's ministry for many years, I can tell you that God has worked through some kids in some powerful ways, and I could tell you some stories about that. I love that in the book of 1 and 2 Timothy, when Paul is talking to this young leader, Timothy, in the church, he doesn't say, hey, wait until you're older and then you can learn. No, he says, hey, don't let anybody look down on you because you're young. He said, you set the example. He said, you set the example in all these things. And then you look at Moses, who stood up in front of the entire nation of Israel when he was older, and he was talking to all these other older people, and he said, hey, the best thing you can do as older people is to pass your faith on to the next generation. Basically, set the example. So if you're too young, you set the example. If you're too old, you set the example. We don't have an excuse because of our age. I also love the story of the prophet Samuel when he goes to pick the next king of Israel, and he goes to the house of Jesse, and he knows that God's going to pick one of these sons, and so he looks at this lineup of all these sons, and he goes down the line one by one, and he's like, not this one, not this one, not this one. Where's the other son? And he's like, oh, he's out in the field, the youngest one. Like, he's probably not. You don't want him, but that's who he chose, but the youngest. And when he presented him, I love this verse in 1 Samuel 16:7. It says, the Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. He looks at your heart. Are you available to him? It's not about your age. It's not if you're too young or too old. It's about your availability. Will you step out? Will you be an example? The third one we use, I'm just not good enough. This one I think is probably the most common I've heard. Like, I'm just not good enough. Like maybe there's this general sense of like low confidence, low self-esteem, like just general, Satan shuts us down because we're not willing to use our gifts because we're just not good enough. And it's like this misconception that like you have to have your life all together before God can use you. And the problem with this excuse is that you're never gonna feel good enough. I remember getting married, and then also like when I've talked to other people that were married and they're thinking about having kids, and they're like, oh, well, we'll have kids when we're ready. Like, you are never ready. Like, you are never ready until that baby pops out and you take it home, and then you have to go through the process because you learn as you go, right? And you don't know until you go, and you just kind of sometimes have to jump in and start swimming, right? And realize that if you've ever had this excuse, you're in good company, because if you don't feel good enough, I want you to think about the people that Jesus picked to follow him. Like, if you were to say, Jesus, pick the people that are good enough in this culture or society, he probably would have picked the Sadducees or the Pharisees or the scribes. That's not who he picked. He picked ordinary people. He picked fishermen. He picked tax collectors. He picked accountants. And I love the story in Acts when Peter and John are preaching boldly in the temple courts, and then they get called in front of the rulers, and they're questioning them, and they're like, who are these guys, right? And then there's this verse in Acts 4:13. It says this, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and they realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. They were unschooled. They were ordinary. And they were like, whoa, who are these guys? Like, they shouldn't be able to do these things. You see, they weren't adequate either, but God was working powerfully through them because they'd made themselves available. You don't have to be good enough because he is good enough. He's good enough to fill in the gaps. The next one, the last one I want to talk about. I've made too many mistakes. Or maybe I've made like a really big mistake. I remember talking one time to this guy, and he was telling me about his past, and he just kept talking about how bad he was. And he was just like, you don't understand how bad I was. And he just kept going out into these stories. I'd be like, okay. And he's like, no, like it was really bad. I'm like, okay. No, it was really, really bad. Like, you don't understand how bad I was. I just remember, after 15 minutes of me telling him telling me how bad he was, I was just like, you don't understand how good God is. Like, it's not about how bad you are. Like, God is big enough to cover your inadequacies. But so many people are going around with this idea, and they're carrying this guilt and this shame, and they just can't wrap their heads around this fact that Jesus truly did pay it all. And I also remember this time I called this lady. I used to have to make follow-up phone calls when I was a pastor to people that were new to the church, and I called this lady, and we were having an incredible conversation. She was really new to her faith, and she just kept asking me all these questions about baptism and why we do this and why we do that. And we got on the topic of communion, and she was like, so what's this communion thing? And I'm like, well, it's where we pass these trays, and we have juice and bread, and we remember what Jesus did for us on the cross, and it represents his body and his blood, and it's a time for us to come together around a table as a family, just like they did in the early church. They broke bread together, and if you believe in Jesus, you should do that with us, and it's like a time for us to kind of all be together in silence and remember what he did. And I remember her next thing to me just kind of broke my heart, because she was like, well, that sounds really cool, but I can't do that, right? And I was like, why can't you take communion? And she was like, well, I just don't think I should take communion. I'm like, you believe in Jesus, right? She's like, yeah, but I just don't think I should take it. I'm like, are you allergic to grape juice? I don't understand. Why can't you take communion with us? And she's like, well, you see, when I was a teenager, I had a child out of wedlock. And so I don't think I should do that because I did something really bad. And in that moment, it was like one of those moments where Holy Spirit gave me the words, I think, to say to her. I said, if you can't take communion because of something you did, then none of us can take communion, because we've all messed up. There's nobody. If sinners couldn't take communion, there would be no communion. We wouldn't have anybody worthy to carry the trays, to lead the meditation. There would be nothing for us to do. There are no perfect people. There is only a perfect Savior. And here's the other question I've been wrestling with as I think through this, because so many of us, we believe God in some areas and not in others. We believe that God's good enough to provide for us, that He's gonna provide for our physical needs, but we don't believe that He could provide to meet His purpose through us. He's good enough over here, but not in this. We're still too bad. He can't do that, but He can take care of me financially or physically. And the other thing is these mistakes that we turn to and we remind ourselves of, these are tools that God has put in our past that we can use to help others, maybe either avoid the same mistakes we had, or maybe walk alongside someone through a painful situation that we've already on the other side of. And these mistakes are not wasted if they are lessons learned, and if we can turn out and use them by making ourselves available, because God can take these messed up situations and turn them around in our own lives, and then He can help us do the same in others. And these are just a few of the excuses we use. There's a whole lot more. But the reason these excuses pose a big problem is because these excuses lead us to inaction. Like I said earlier, they shut us down. They paralyze us. They keep us from doing what God is calling us to do. And He's more concerned with our availability than He is our adequacy. And I was thinking about this idea of like David, later on, after he was picked as the king, he still had this period of waiting. And I remember that story where he went out to visit his brothers on the battlefield, and he walked up on this scene where there's this huge giant Goliath, and he's 9 feet tall, and he's just taunting the people of God. And David steps into the situation, and think about David in that moment and what he chose to do. He chose to fight the giant, but yet he had every excuse in the book. Many of them I just listed, I don't know enough, or I'm too young, or maybe I'm not skilled enough, I don't have what it takes. He had every excuse. In fact, if we were sitting there beside David, we'd probably be like, yeah, David, you probably don't got what it takes. You probably should run the other way. You probably should cop out of this one, right? Making an excuse would be okay for you right now. But he didn't do that. He stepped up. He made himself available despite incredible odds against him. And he used what he had, and he made himself available. He picked up a stone and a sling. He did take the experience he had already had of fighting a bear and a lion, and he swung that stone around, and he hit that giant right between his eyes, and he fell down. Because he was available, and he didn't make excuses when everybody else would have probably been like, that's all right, you don't have to do this. And when we buy into these excuses and we lead ourselves to an action, we miss opportunities for God to use us. And that is not what God is calling us to do. He's calling us to make the most of every opportunity. Colossians 4:5 says this. It says, be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Basically, be really smart when you're hanging around people that don't know me. Look at that as an opportunity. And And that's why we say every time we gather together, like, we need you to move closer to people that need to move closer to Jesus. Like we have all this opportunity. And if you grew up here, you may not know this, but this is one of the most unchurched areas of the country. There are more people in this state that don't know Jesus than almost any state in the country, and in a country in the world where there's probably just as high of a percentage. Like, everywhere you go, there are opportunities around you. And here's the thing, you cannot make the most of every opportunity when you're making excuses. And we are not like my high school basketball team. We're not sharing jerseys, right? There's no one in on your place on the off weeks. Like, it's all you. You have your own number. When you follow him, you are in the game every time. You are relied upon by God, but you've got to step out in faith. And that's why we always say at 6:03 every day, we're going to make that reminder. We're going to make it a priority. We are going to make the most of every opportunity, and we're going to pray this prayer: God, move me closer to people that need to move closer to you. And when we make ourselves available and we step out in faith, God is He's going to do some things. He's doing things. We have stories upon stories of what God's doing when we pray that prayer and we step out in faith. But we can't do it if we're sitting around making excuses. So as we leave tonight, I want you guys to stand up. And maybe you've never prayed that prayer before, or maybe you've never really believed that God could do it through you. And tonight I want you to kind of think about this prayer in a new way. Maybe for the first time, believe that God could use you to move someone closer. And to lay your excuses aside and to be ready this week to act if you really pray this prayer and believe it. And if you're online with us too, we invite you to do the same with us. So we're going to pray this prayer together. It's going to be on the screen. God, move me closer to people that need to move closer to you. And this week, He's going to show up and he's going to do something. He's going to put somebody in your path. And it's going to be up to you whether you're going to step up or you're going to make an excuse. But if you do, be prepared to God use you in a powerful way. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for our time together. I thank you for all these people in this room and for the people online. And we just pray this week that we really will act out what we have just said with our mouths, and that our eyes will be open for you and how you're going to work and how you're going to use, and that when we see that moment, God, and that fear and doubt creep in, God, that you would give us a boldness like never before to step up and to step out and to be used by you and to make ourselves available to whatever it is that you're calling us to do. So we pray these things in your name. Amen. All right, we're so glad you joined us tonight. Go and be the church this week.